everyone. Welcome. I'm Sophie Earhart, and this is my colleague, Nicie Panetta, Vice President of Advancement.
Hi, Sophie.
Hello. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, everyone. We're going to wait a little bit before we get started while people sign on and join us, because we've got a lot of people signed up tonight to hear from Cal about when humans pull back and how abandoned places recover.
Yeah, it's really been gratifying to see people signing up from literally all over the world to join us tonight. And we thank you all for your time and your commitment to wild nature. And perhaps it's no surprise given the global nature of the book we're discussing and of Cal Flyn's audience. So we're grateful for that. And just want to thank all of our Northeast Wilderness Trust family of wild supporters who are, some of whom are with us tonight. We appreciate all you do to help us protect new wilderness areas across the Northeast.
It's fun to see the names as people sign up, some familiar and some new ones. And yeah, the global reach is pretty fun to see. So,
Yeah,
tell us
and we
about the bandana, Nicie.
Yeah, we couldn't resist sharing out with you all. This is a wonderful new edition of an annual tradition here at Newt. We commission an artist to design a bandana for our Forever Wild Circle members. These are our monthly sustaining supporters who do so much to keep the lights on here at the Mother Tree, our Newt headquarters, and across the region for all of our staff. So special gratitude to all Forever Wild Circle members, and check it out. You might want to consider joining this wonderful group of sustainers. So thank you for that. And Sophie,
This is
you
this
have
is a
these.
great bandana this year. Yeah, I'm going to up my annual contribution. Every time you go up a little bit, you get the bandana for the year, and uh, this one is really beautiful. So I'm not familiar with that artist. This is a Vermont artist, Dylan Fant.
Dylan Fant, yeah, and he's very well known. He designs all kinds of wonderful posters for musicians, and we were thrilled to partner with him on this beautiful vision, a kind of a peaceable, wild future that we can all look forward to.
I'll have to add to my portfolio. I wear them in the field doing field work, and they wipe off a lot of glasses and clean a lot of the screens and things for me. So I love it. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, we can look forward to the annual dog who wore it best Newt dog photo with a bandana
Great.
in action.
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty great. Well, this is a slide from our wilderness preserve called Eagle Mountain, which is in New York. It's about 2,400 acres. And what a shot. I love that picture. Well, I think now that I've introduced Eagle Mountain, you all introduce myself, and we'll just kind of start to get going here. I'm Sophie Earhart. I'm the Vermont Land Steward for Northeast Wilderness Trust. And it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I'm really excited to hear from Cal Flyn about researching and visiting some surprising places where humans have stepped back and disturbance has diminished. We're really grateful to Cal for participating in this speaker series. I would love to stand in some of the places that you've been, but for tonight, I'm just glad to be here with you and all of our guests online, and to listen to the conversation between you and Nicie. And to our audience, which is very widespread, thank you so much for being here. For any of you who aren't familiar with Northeast Wilderness Trust, we sometimes call ourselves Newt. We were founded about a quarter of a century ago to fill a niche in the land trust arena. We are the only regional land trust that focuses entirely on rewilding. And we have an ecocentric focus. So while we conserve forever wild landscapes for nature and for people, our guiding star is this core belief that nature and all of our wild cousins have intrinsic value, independent of any value we humans may or may not assign to them from our perspective. We just reached an important milestone at the Trust. We now protect as forever wild more than 100,000 acres across New England and northeastern New York. So that's kind of a quick and dirty intro to our work, but I invite you to visit our website, and better yet, come to one of our preserves and visit. In a few moments, we'll be rejoined by our presenters, but first I have a couple of housekeeping points to go through with you. First of all, if you have any issues with Zoom during the webinar, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and let us know, and we'll try to help you. Don't use the chat because it's been disabled, and if you use it, we won't get that message. Secondly, the format for the webinar tonight is first, author and journalist Cal Flyn has a presentation and beautiful slides to share with us. Following her presentation, Cal will be joined by Newt's own Nicie Panetta for a conversation about the recovery and flourishing of natural communities in these places where people pull back. After that, there'll be a Q&A with you, the online participants. So please submit your questions using that same Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The webinar hosts will see your questions. We'll do our best to ask as many of them as we can of the presenters, and they will answer you verbally, but they won't be typing answers into the Q&A. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for tonight. Cal Flyn is a writer from the Highlands of Scotland. She is the author of Thicker Than Water in 2016 and Islands of Abandonment in 2021, a book about the ecology and psychology of abandoned places. The latter won her the title of the UK's Young Writer of the Year and the John Burroughs Medal for Natural History Writing. It was also shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize, the Ondaatje Prize, and the British Academy Book Prize, among others. In 2024, she received the E.M. Forster Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Flyn's next book, The Savage Landscape, How We Made the Wilderness, will be released in July 2026 and is available for pre-order now. Thank you for being here, Cal. It's really an honor to have you here.
Oh, no, thank you for inviting me, and hi to everyone tuning in. It's great to be here.
Childhood experiences in the forests of New Hampshire and California seeded Nicie's love for and sense of home in wild nature. In her role as Northeast Wilderness Trust's Vice President of Advancement, Nicie brings together her experience in finance, communications, and nonprofit leadership to guide our fundraising and communications teams and to help build the Wilderness Trust for the future. So thank you for everything you do and for being here tonight, Nicie.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for that introduction.
So we're going to turn the slides and the mic over to you now, Cal, for your presentation.
Super. Thank you so much. Just give me a brief moment to bring up my presentation for you all. And we'll enter. Super. Well, great to have you all here. My name's Cal Flyn, and I'm going to talk about a project I've been working on for a while, which I suppose came to fruition as a book called Islands of Abandonment. It is an exploration of abandoned environments and ecosystems all over the world. I made a study of 12 different sites, all with very different stories. These are post-industrial sites, very polluted or contaminated sites, maybe war-torn, economically depressed, places that felt to me that the worst had already happened and they'd been left for some time to their own devices. And when I returned to them some decades later, what I found was surprising. I found surprising stories of natural regeneration. You could even characterize them as a kind of redemption story. But all of them have this difficult history and an interesting and often complex present and future. To begin with, I became interested in this subject primarily actually through aesthetics. I was very interested in the work of photographers like Edward Bertinsky, who take these beautiful images of incredibly damaged landscapes. I visited a number of post-industrial sites like former mines, open cast mines in Scotland that have become supporting these incredible lake ecosystems and islands that had been slate mines that looked like these amazing Pantone palettes. And looking at those, I was initially looking at them to see this sort of strange kind of beauty that you can find in these places. But the more that I read about them, the more that I realized there was also a kind of parallel ecological story going on that was just as interesting and really as beautiful in its own way. This is an image I took in Montserrat, which is a Caribbean island where more than a third of the island has been cordoned off as a Zone V. This is the former police station following an volcanic eruption. So much superheated rock and ash came flooding down the mountainside and into what had been the main town, and it has now become sort of overgrown with ferns, with all sorts of trees popping up in this tropical ecosystem. This is a glimpse of the kind of places that I'm looking at in this book. Let me start first by talking about maybe the sort of most straightforward examples. I visited Cyprus, the Mediterranean island, to look at what's known as the Green Line. This is the no man's land that splits the island in two. It's a kind of buffer zone between the North Cyprus, which was invaded by Turkish allied forces in 1974, and South Cyprus, or what's known as Republic of Cyprus, where you have people who would call themselves Greek Cypriot. In between these two areas is this buffer zone, which is at some places only a few miles wide, a few meters wide, and in other places miles wide. It's very dependent on where they are in the landscape. It became to me almost like a kind of fable, or certainly a case study in what the phenomenon I was looking at. So the fact that in buffer zones between warring nations, you often find incredible populations of wildlife and biodiversity has been something that's been noted for a very long time. For example, with the Lewis and Clark expedition, the men on the ground actually noticed this as they traveled between different indigenous groups in North America. They noticed that in regions where the local people were at war with one another, often you would have these large buffer zones where the buffalo, for example, would come to incredible populations. And that was because these were dangerous areas to go, and so they were not hunted. We see modern day equivalents in places like Cyprus or in Korea in the DMZ, where you have these sort of sometimes landmines, certainly fenced off areas where people are too frightened to go, but perhaps animal populations and certainly plant and insect populations often thrive. So I went to Cyprus to look at this phenomenon specifically and also more generally. And here we see an area of farmland on the eastern coast of Cyprus, and this buffer zone cuts all the way through the main city, Nicosia, and out to the other side. As you can see, in some places it's very sort of built up and fenced off, and a group of Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot scientists together made a census of this area in 8 different spots across the island and found an incredible amount of biodiversity. They found very rare endemic species like the Cyprus bee orchid, the mouflon sheep. They found 358 species of plants, more than 100 species of birds, 20 reptiles, amphibians, 18 mammals, an incredible variety for an island of this size. And you also see this in action in places like in the Falklands, where you might have landmine beaches where penguins have become the predominant force. A bit more complicated are sites like these. This is in Scotland, where I'm from. So we have these post-industrial sites called bings. They're really like large landforms, almost sort of mountainous, where they produce paraffin oil by digging up this oil shale, sort of superheating the rock, evaporating off the paraffin, and then leaving these grains of the shale in mountains. They're very unpopular locally for a very long time. As you can see, they're sort of chaotic spaces. People take dirt bikes up them, and in the left you can see places where teenagers have been strewing around sort of toilet paper and setting fire to things. They are a strange and beautiful landscape of their own, very feral kind of landscape, and the trees that predominate here are silver birches. You get very rare assemblages of species in places like this. They're really like a kind of petri dish. They started from nothing, really nothing in terms of nutrients in the substrate whatsoever. And over time, they've gradually sort of gathered momentum. And what we've found very strangely is that the places that had been highly managed, especially for aesthetic reasons, kind of flattened over, planted, fertilizer added, have actually done much worse. It is the self-seeded ones that have managed to survive and that are doing really well and are very biodiverse, even though they don't look like any kind of landscape that we've had before. It's just the species that happen to do well there found a situation that they can make work for them. It's a very strange place. In the UK, we've come to appreciate these landscapes a lot more. This is a former dynamite works. And this kind of landscape has now been classed as something called the open mosaic habitat. It's become a priority habitat in the UK, and it's usually seen in derelict sites. You might have fallen down old walls, you might have moss-covered car parks, you might have, here they have cooling ponds. Anything like this, all in close succession together, that's the mosaic. And that's really good for invertebrate life because they need different kind of habitats for different stages in their life cycle. So this site is really, really good for invertebrate life. I looked at some other sites as well. Now, this is a site with a very difficult history. This is in France, near the site of the Battle of Verdun. And it's a place where, after the First World War, they took chemical weapons and they burnt them in what was a small clearing in the forest and has now become quite a large clearing in the forest. If you test the ground here, as German scientists did about 15 years ago, you will find that the soil by weight is 17% arsenic, 13% lead in places, 13% zinc in places, and 2% lead. So what you do find is that these sites of this kind can still support life, perhaps not incredible quantities. These might not be biodiverse sites, but they often support life of scientific interest. Here, because the soil is so toxified with heavy metals, only certain numbers of plants will live there. These will be metallophyte plants, metal-loving or metal-tolerant plants. Some of these plants are simply able to shut themselves off to metal in the environment and not take it up in the way that other plants will. And others actively sort of court metal and will appear in places like this, which is an unusual example, but also places like metal mines and naturally occurring regions of ore around the world. Here are a few examples of the sort of species that you might class as a metallophyte. The calmine violet, for example, which can be found in places where I think it's lead is very popular. In the bottom right, you'll find a really interesting example, which is a plant from New Caledonia, which bleeds a kind of copper-tinged latex if you cut it. These are plants that do well in these unusual habitats. And I found in a site in Wales, a former smelting area known locally as Copperopolis, that when you start repairing these landscapes, as you might wish to do after industry, you might make a landscape that supports fewer of these interesting species. And they were left in a strange bind. Should they scrape up and retoxify the soil that they had so carefully repaired, or should they allow it to return to a less notable, but more like its original form type of woodland? And I think that these sites really pose some very difficult moral questions for us. You know, once we have damaged them, should we return them to the way that they were before? Or do we allow them to become something else, something wild and something self-sustaining? Some other ethical problems came to the fore in this site. These are photos actually by a photographer called Evgenia Arabugoeva. But I went there myself. This is a botanical garden in Amani in Tanzania. It was created by the Germans during the period of German East Africa, taken over by the British when it was changed from a botanical research institute into one interested in malaria, and latterly allowed to fall into disrepair. So I met a scientist, the last person working there actually, as someone working for the lab rather than a scientist, who was looking after a colony of lab mice and had been doing so for about 20 years with no scientists coming in. It was mothballed completely. But what had been happening in the meantime was that many of the plants that had been planted by the Germans, more than 1,000 different species from all over the world, were sort of escaping from the garden and getting into this very fragile cloud forest habitat. Now, the cloud forest is full of incredibly rare species. We have the Amani flatwing. It's one of the most critically endangered insects in the world. We have a kind of tree frog, which has only been seen once ever. And all of these species that are now, we have a lot of concern because their environment is changing around them very quickly because of these invasive species. Here are some of the species that were sort of breaking out and causing a great deal of problems. Some of these are problems all around the formerly colonial world. And the big one that I want to draw your attention to is Mysopsis emini, which is down on the bottom right. This umbrella tree grows in Kenya naturally, but it wouldn't grow naturally in these very high environments in Tanzania. There was a huge amount of worry about this in the 1980s, right up until the 2000s, because it had spread very widely from its original test plots into the forest. This was the first time that tree had invaded a continental location, and it was forecast that it might invade and make up half of all natural forest. Even 6% of pristine unfelled forests in that area were already Mysopses. It was too late to cut them down, it would cause too much damage. And so we were sort of watching what might be a crisis unfold. However, disaster was averted. Under its own devices, the spread of this species slowed down. Once these trees, the umbrella trees, were offering shade, local species were beginning to pop up underneath them and were able to compete again. What we've now seen is that species like the Mysopsis, like the Lantana camera, the Clademia, are slowly being sort of absorbed into these natural habitats. Like, again, these habitats do not look the way that they did before they were affected by humans, but they are, or rather before they were replanted and sort of deeply impacted in that way. But they are adapting and they are becoming a new kind of ecosystem. Sometimes people call these novel ecosystems. You see this a lot in Puerto Rico in former plantations. About 60% of the land in Puerto Rico is now described as a novel ecosystem, a sort of mix of different species that might otherwise not naturally come together. So my book forced me to think about the power of regeneration, how quickly things can turn around or change. You can see, for example, in the history of the United States, how much tree cover has changed, and this results from movements of farmers across the country and how quickly certain areas, especially in the Northeast, we might see tree cover regenerating. And I suspect that in the future, this is a pattern we are going to see around the world. We are seeing falling fertility rates all across the Western world, and the global population is expected to peak in 2064. Already an area the size of Italy has been left abandoned in Europe. Italy, Spain, Portugal are all countries that have huge numbers of settlements that have fallen into disrepair. 3/4 of Spanish council areas are in decline in terms of population. Japan is forecast to drop from 127 million total to 120 million by 2064. Already they talk about IKEA or ghost houses. These are abandoned houses, derelict houses whose ownership are very difficult to trace. I think what we're looking at increasingly is going to be a landscape that is dominated by species that can recover, regenerate after we have impacted the environment. And I think that what my book forced me to do was to think a great deal about how we value these landscapes and how we can allow them to reach their full potential. And that might not be by weighing in and controlling how they develop, but instead to see what species arrive, what species can make this work under these self-willed, self-sustaining conditions, and a kind of radical kind of acceptance that we may not be able to control what other species are doing and what it will look like. I just wanted to show you some of these pictures just to start off our conversation, give you a sense of what I've been working on. So why don't I pull down, here we are. I think we've returned to the room. Is that correct?
Heck yeah.
Hi.
Did you have another photo you wanted to share? I wasn't sure if I followed you at the very end there.
It was just
Finish
going to
the
be
slides.
a cover of my own book.
Yeah, okay.
I see I've left somewhat early, but
Well, thank you for your talk. That was really, I mean, those photos are so beautiful and so much to think about in that presentation. First of all, I didn't know metal fights was a word, so that was
metallophytes,
new for me.
yeah.
Yeah, and the ethical question you raise about restoration is something I actually think about a lot, which is really interesting because we humans do favor certain species, or sometimes we're attached to the ones that we know used to be somewhere, and then um, when something else is thriving in a place for whatever reason, because of disturbance or because of the climate changing or whatever it is, you have to wrestle with that. How much do we want to try to restore something to the way it was, and how much do we want to let things be places that they want to be? It goes back to their intrinsic right to exist.
Mm, absolutely. I kind of think of these locations as almost like provocations, places that really force us to think about, yeah, about our values or how we can sort of support other species without necessarily sort of dictating, and what does that mean on a daily basis?
Mhm. Okay, so Nisi, are you back with us?
I hope
And
so.
yeah, so just a reminder to our guests on Zoom before you two start having a more in-depth conversation. Questions can be submitted with the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And when Cal and Nisi wrap up, I'll be asking your questions. So if you have one, please submit it at any time. So Cal and Nisi, um, I guess, I'd like to ask you just about your process with writing Islands of Abandonment, and just if you can, I mean, I think you covered a little bit of like your inspiration for it and seeing these places, but you can talk more about that if you want to. But also maybe if you just talk a little bit about the making of it, how you chose some of the sites and anything unexpected that happened, or adventures or memorable surprises, something like that. That would be great.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the what was important to me was that each place should essentially be a kind of symbol of something or an example of some larger force. So I knew that I wanted to write about invasive species. I knew that I wanted to write about feral animals, for example. So for that, I looked for an island and found one very close to home, where I'm from in Scotland, where cattle have been roaming for several decades and sort of redefining what it means to be a cow, in as much as they live in these non-gender divide societies. They behave very differently to how what I think of as domestic cattle behave, and it's a much more difficult life for them in some ways, but it's also much more like what wild cattle or wild ox would, how they would live. And I found that to be, again, sort of provocative, that for me even to think about what that meant. Um, and to find places that somehow embodied these ideas in some way.
Yeah, wonderful. I think maybe as a follow-on to that, um, we often in our work encounter, and even I can say for my own self, when I first was thinking about what a wilderness might be years ago, I was thinking, oh, a wilderness is a especially beautiful place. A wilderness is a place that's far away, it's remote from all of us, and it's a place that's unpeopled. That's where nature gets to be, and there aren't people around. And I think one of the great things about your book is that it shows how places can be wild, even though they are, in fact, not at all pristine. Humans have incurred quite, great damage. The landscape has incurred great damage due to humans, and they are not remote. They can be in cities, and they are certainly not unpeopled. And I think that's for me, reading the book, which was just one of the great reading experiences for me of the pandemic and really influenced my own journey, it's the way people that you kept encountering people in the landscape that in such surprising ways that I found really moving in its own way. So maybe you could talk about some of those tropes and what you found.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it did take a while for me to sort of settle on what exactly is this. You know, the word abandoned to me seemed obvious, but when I was drilling down into it, I'd often arrive in places that were sort of famously abandoned. And um, for example, I go to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which was a well-known example of this idea of natural regeneration in very difficult circumstances. This was before the current war. And what I found there was that there were people working in the plant because they are decommissioning. There is a sort of staff coming in and out. It has large areas of sort of relatively uncontrolled land in comparison to what was before, but there are also people who have snuck back in and were living within the villages, which were extremely derelict, but they would have sort of islands of lived-in houses. Or what would it mean to be abandoned in the context of a city? Like in Detroit, I wanted to write about the so-called urban prairie, where there's all this sort of wild regeneration on former gardens, play parks, and so on. But when you get there, of course, it's still a densely populated city, even if the population has declined a great deal. And so that pushed me to really sort of question what this might be. What does it mean to be abandoned? And it was all to do, I suppose, with um, this having its own direction that perhaps the original purpose of a building or a piece of land had been abandoned, but nevertheless, there are always agendas that come in the second that anybody leaves. You have these different species with different agendas, but also different people with different agendas. I found a lot of people living homeless in Paterson, New Jersey, inside some urban ruins. And again, there were a lot of people in there, even though it looked like a completely abandoned place. And I think that then made me think a lot more about this psychology of abandonment as well. It wasn't just about aesthetics, it wasn't just about ecology, but it was also about what abandoned places mean to us as humans. And often they're frightening in some way, but they're also um, they excite us in a way that I hadn't really fully interrogated before.
Yeah, I felt that reading the book. You do such an extraordinary job of creating those or describing those moments where the actions of wild nature are cropping up in all of this infrastructure, and then again, humans again present in ways that you might not have anticipated originally. And actually, it does raise the question about fear a little bit. There are a lot of sort of uncanny moments in the book with bats suddenly looking at you from ceiling fans and that kind of thing. And I wonder what you make of that, especially as you've had some time to reflect on the book now that's been out for a while, that fear that we might have of a place that's rewilding.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, I think that is part of what tells us that it is slipping from our control. And the book really became a book about control and our ideas of control of the natural world and our need or maybe our psychological drive to control the natural world around us. And so stepping into a place that is rewilding in this sort of capacious sense. It is intimidating often. You have the sense that the normal rules do not apply. You have the sense there might be uncontrolled animals, that if there are people, they are people that you don't know who they are or why they're there. And that in itself can be quite frightening. Um, and I became very familiar with all of these sort of smells and sensations that were to do with abandoned spaces, which was like the feel of like crunching glass underfoot, or the smell of like decaying cement and that sort of dampness of smell. Like all of these became my sort of familiar habitats for over the space of a couple of years, well, 2 to 3 years really, while I was researching this book. And I was scared really a lot of the time. And I think that to me started becoming like a signal to myself that I was getting somewhere good, that this was where I was meant to be going. And if I was finding it difficult, then good, I was following the sort of scent to its source kind of thing.
Fantastic. And that makes me think of the sort of music of the book, which is your writing. And I was wondering if you would give us just a bit of a taste of the book, maybe from that wonderful chapter about Cyprus, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about how you came to write the book in the way that you did.
Sure, absolutely. I'm going to take a little bit from the Cyprus chapter right at the end. Um, I head west past the old airport and weave up into steep remote country, pointless hills stippled with shrubbery, the rock orange-grey in places, blue-grey in others. This is the most remote region of the island, where the buffer zone is widest. Observation towers here stand far apart and sometimes abandoned. I pass more than one, painted in amateurish camouflage of sand and dun, where some bleached signs warn against ingress, their alarming tones somewhat undone by the golden floral halo pillowing up around their legs. Finally, I see it. I pull up close to a UN helicopter pad that is baking in the sun and take out my binoculars. Across a valley of no man's land, a second mountain arises between me and the sea. On the slope facing me, I sight the village of Varicea. Even from far away, it's clear that this is no ordinary village. It has a ghostly presence. Even looking at it gives me a chill. There are gaps where the windows and doors should be. Pale grey walls crumble into dust. Red roofs peek between trees that press tightly in against the whitewashed walls as if supporting them through their collapse. The terraced landscape is softened, eroded, and overgrown. But though the village is long abandoned, I see movement. Birds flit from the windows and roofs. It was here that Sally Goosel and his colleagues found their most striking results of all. In the empty village high in the hills, they discovered the highest species richness of all sites surveyed. Cyprus mouflon, a wild sheep found only on this island, were discovered to have reoccupied the empty houses, using them for shelter from the sun and winter storms. Numbers of these hardy dwarf sheep, with their russet coats and huge scythe-like horns, fell to only a few dozen in the 20th century, despite their cherished status as a national symbol. Yet here they were, dozens of them, caught on film, looking off camera and moving with a relaxed stride. During the stalemate, the mouflon have thrived in the abandoned villages, roaming in large groups down empty lanes, grazing the farmland left fallow. In all, through a combination of huge areas of new habitat in the buffer zone and stricter protections, numbers are thought to have rebounded to 3,000 or more. Also recorded, slipping through the deserted village, barn owls with their pale, heart-shaped faces hunting the rare endemic mouse, Mus cypriaca. Brown hares loping wide-eyed through the long grass, blunt-nosed vipers, spiny lizards, and the leopard-spotted camouflage of the Mediterranean chameleon. Here in the silent valley, where the golden pollen dusts my skin and birdsong drifts through the air, war feels a long way off. The sun beats warm through a thin haze of cloud. A sea breeze ruffles the trees. A cicada rasps the scale, first up, then down. Songbirds tumble in the air, oblivious to my presence. Sparrows and wheatears with black backs and necks and rose-taupe bellies. A swallow strafes the road, swerving this way, then that.
Thank you so much. I think this is a wonderful example of what I thought of when I wrote about your book for my Substack back during the pandemic as a sort of a syncopation that kind of occurs naturally, or I think artfully, as you juxtapose these decaying human infrastructure elements with the life bursting forth, reasserting its rhythms all around. But I'm curious, you were a previously published author, how you felt like your writing settled in to really suit this material for this book.
Mm, I think it's interesting with the nonfiction because you're sort of working between these hard sort of points of fact or something like this. You've got to find a way to naturally weave in and out and bring in information without sort of hanging yourself up on the details of it. It can be difficult to not lapse into the sound of the tenor of the report. And so I think it's always that push and pull whenever you write nonfiction, especially in that sort of more creative or literary end of nonfiction, to try and have this sense of flow, of movement, of atmosphere. I think the most important thing for me is to be able to feel like you're in a place, because to do the research to me was such a impactful, evocative, emotional experience. And I wanted to bring some of that through as well so that it wasn't just for me. I would be able to sort of express it somehow. And so trying to find that register and not switch too hard between the two modes of writing is something that I'm constantly working on. And I don't think that I have it perfect, and it will just be a project for the rest of my life.
A worthy one indeed. Well, that sort of reminds me too that you also had to suit your writing to all of these very diverse places. And I wonder, having traveled all over the world for this book, and I gather for your forthcoming work, um, what you've observed about the changes that having abandoned or depopulated areas, how communities, what's the range of responses that you've seen from human communities in terms of acceptance or even celebration of what might be transpiring?
Well, it's often these things are very emotionally charged and not wholly welcome actually from the sort of the local community or people who perhaps lived in a location during its heyday and have seen its apparent decline. That's a very difficult thing for people to live alongside, and it's a very difficult thing for people to quote unquote celebrate. Cyprus is a really good example of that. I spoke to a man who could point out his farm, which was in the middle of the buffer zone, and he could say, I don't feel like I move on with my life, while he'd been a wealthy farming family, and he was like, I began life like this, and now I'm here, and I haven't been able to marry, I haven't been able to move on. I'm just constantly waiting for this to be solved, and I'm watching our orange groves, desiccate away, which they have done, and what's he left with? And so I think constantly you have to balance these very difficult human stories, which are in some of the locations that I go to, on a real grand scale. When we talk about Chernobyl, um, and sometimes they're on the level of individual families. When I talk about that abandoned island, where it was just one family who lived there for a long time and then left their cattle on it. And to these people, it might not feel redemptive. And I think that that's important to give it weight and to understand that many things can be true of a piece of land at once, that it can be good for this reason, bad for this reason. That a really strong example of this is if you look to the High Line in New York, which like I love to walk there and walk along, and it's a lovely thing to have in the middle of the city. What it was before was essentially a kind of feral wild landscape that has now been dug up and replanted with plants from outside. And so you can look at it on lots of different levels, which is from the point of view of architecture or from the point of view of community services. It's now become something really amazing. And then from the point of view of, I don't know, sort of wild nature, it might be something lost. And I think being able to hold these many things in our mind at once and allow them all to be true is an important way of learning to be sophisticated when we think about our relationship with the natural world.
Absolutely. And we, of course, in our work are creating new wilderness areas within often the northern forest of New England, but also really across. Some of our preserves are in suburban areas. One's quite close to a Walmart and yet hosts globally rare plant species, the Plymouth rose gentian, and some rare bone sets that are thriving along the edge of that beautiful muddy pond. And the the use of that land has changed as we have taken over, and some of the activities in terms of vehicular access have been reduced, and that we believe has allowed a lot of vernal pools to reemerge and the amphibian life and so forth to thrive. And it's a change, and so our staff do a lot of work in the community to help folks come to terms and understand and appreciate what we're trying to accomplish. But it's a conversation that's really rich and important to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's a push and pull me in all sorts of different ways because you have certain species that really respond from a lack of disturbance and certain species that really respond to disturbance. And knowing how to balance that is a very tricky sort of tightrope to walk.
It's so true. And for example, the Northern Forest, many of our lands are former timberlands, and
Mhm.
they're adjacent to currently actively managed timberlands. And there are species that actually do quite well with that combination and that juxtaposition. The Canada lynx is one example where they love to hunt in more open areas, such as recently cut over areas, because they go after the snowshoe hare there. And they really need quiet spaces to den and less disturbance, and that some of that downed wood areas where they can kind of nestle in and be safe. Um, so that's all very true and alive in the landscape.
Absolutely. In Estonia, I went to a region which had been, I think, a wheat growing area for a long time. And since the breakdown of the collective farming system after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of this farmland has regrown and is becoming forest in some form. And they are actually worrying about the sort of negative effects on biodiversity if it becomes too dense of a forest, because they find, these sort of edgelands are where a lot of species love to be, and in the darker forest less so. And so
Yeah.
how do they manage that? They're sort of artificially keeping clearings in some places, and it's an interesting, I guess, philosophy that they've now got to build.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, Maybe this is a moment to talk a little bit about your next book coming out, which is also about wild places, but from a different perspective or a different angle. So maybe share just a little bit about Savage Landscape and how you came to that project and how it's unfolded.
Yes, absolutely. So the savage landscape, it's I suppose in some sense is a history of the idea of wilderness, retracing from ancient concepts, often tied together with ideas of epiphany, of revelation, moving through the aesthetics of wild landscapes and the birth of landscape photography and landscape painting into, I guess, the way that wilderness came to be a kind of conservation ideal, particularly in the 20th century. It was much later than I had originally understood, and how this idea, I think, born in the United States of the unpeopled landscape, came to predominate for a while and is now sort of slipping away again from being in the limelight. And that these different ideas of what a wilderness might be, I've again looked for places that really emblematize that all the way around the world. So I went to the Sinai Desert to talk about these revelations. I went to Iceland to talk about the sublime, to southwest Uganda to talk to conservation refugees. These are people who have been displaced by the creation of national parks, from this idea that people and wildlife cannot coexist together, which, now that we talk a lot more about ideas of traditional ecological knowledge, we begin to see that it's a much more complicated picture than that. It's not exclusion itself that is so important, but different ways of being able to coexist alongside nature in different forms, and what that might mean, and being able to have a less, I guess, sort of enforced and rigid way of approaching what a wilderness might be in the present.
That's great. And I know for us, we think a lot about the theme that you touched on earlier about humans basically stepping back. So we talk about stepping up to step back and the idea of self-willed land and providing freedom to the land. But it's a rich and complex territory, and we're so glad that you're going to be exploring it. Can't wait to get the book. I know we have a lot of amazing questions already popping up from our wonderful audience. So maybe I'll just leave with one last question, which is this book has such a pride of place in my bookshelf, and I'm sure that many many books were important to you before you came to write it, and maybe have recently become important to you as you continue your researches. I'm wondering if you have a couple of recommendations or books that you really revere and admire in the sort of nature writing space.
Absolutely. I always recommend Elizabeth Colbert's writing in all its forms, because I just think that she's so good at going out, reporting, really finding people who are affected by what she's writing about. Again, digging down into these sort of like big ethical questions often that I find so intriguing. The Sixth Extinction made a really deep impact on me, but she's also written Under a White Sky recently, and I think she's got I think it's called The Book of Hope. It just recently came out. So there's that, and then there's a British writer called Fred Pearce. He's been a reporter for the New Scientist for decades actually, and everything he writes is so good. He's very sort of factual. He'll go out I always feel whenever I start looking into a subject, I find that he's been there ahead of me and probably like 30 years ago. So Fred Pierce is the guy, he knows everything that's going on.
That's great. Thank you so much. Sophie, welcome back.
Hi, thank you. I was jotting down those books. I haven't read Under a White Sky yet. Yeah, The Sixth Extinction is yeah, it really is something life change or changes your thinking. We do have a lot of questions from the um, participants tonight, so I'm gonna just throw some of those at you. And the first one I'm gonna read here says, the rationale for a let it be approach repeatedly referred to sites that were habitat for rare species, but would you feel the same about sites that supported only common exotic species?
Yeah, I mean, I do think at some level the surrender of control to me is an important value, and that when we are constantly sort of setting outcomes and goals for a piece of land, that actually brings with it a certain amount of expectation, and that our attempts to meet these goals can actually change the future of this plot of land. And so that's something worth bearing in mind, that there might be something of value that we're not measuring, um, that's sort of going on in there. And we have a lot of species that we don't like for lots of different reasons. And that might be because we perceive them to be common, or we perceive them to be invaders, or things like that. And I don't know, I suppose my my feeling is that when we are constantly making these value judgments on other species, it is another form of control of the land, and that it is worth sometimes allowing things to happen to see what will happen.
Yeah. Certainly, we uh, believe that there's value in the intrinsic right of nature to be free, but we also think it's incredibly useful as a scientific baseline to have significant areas of the landscape unmanaged so that those who are devoted to various forms of management have something to compare it to, even if they're doing very worthy things, like, thinking about climate smart forestry or, other kinds of approaches that are worth trying. But how do you really know if there's not that comparison?
Absolutely, and often species that have been really dominant, they don't always stay that way forever. And so that is worth bearing in mind, that something that seems to be incredibly common for a few decades may not be incredibly common in a few decades. And I don't know. I think my point is it's almost like a kind of humbling mechanism to say, okay, maybe we can't what's the word? Um, Sort of dictate what should happen and who should be the winners.
And humility is a word that our president and CEO uses a lot in his writing, the humility of that approach to nature. And it is valuable. We always think we know what we're doing. And then if you look at the course of how things have unfolded over the generations, we don't have the same long view that nature has. We kind of have a human length of time we look at. Um, so the next question says, could you share what you expanded on at the end of your book regarding how humans have been a source of damage, not only in our actions, but also in our theories about plants and animals' intelligence, and how we honestly and deeply contend with that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the core of that? It was to do with plants and animals' intelligence.
Yeah, yeah. So expand on what was in the end of your book regarding how humans have been a source of damage, not only in our actions, but also in our theories about plants and animals' intelligence. And
Okay, yeah,
how
I
do
mean,
we contend with that? Yeah.
I suppose the big question is, as I see it, in terms of our damage on the biggest scale, is climate change, and I think we can't really get away from that. climate change running out of control is actually way beyond most of the damage that I look at in the book. Even some of the damage in terms of what happened in Chernobyl in terms of the time frame and the area affected, climate change is off the scale. And so to me, I think looking at all these different sites helped me understand how certain types of environmental damage can be almost like a flesh wound. It can be something that will be regrow really quickly. That might be you go out and you cut down a patch of forest and then you walk away and you leave it and you come back in a few decades and it might look almost exactly the same. Then you have more sort of long-lasting kinds of damage where you might go and build, a car park or put down some tarmac over an area, and that might in 30 or 40 years be an interesting and valuable ecosystem of its own in this kind of like open mosaic type habitat. And then you have these other kinds of damage that might last forever. You might have things like these forever chemicals, and in terms of climate, we're actually looking at millennia is going to change the course of the planet. So I suppose that helping me understand the different sort of how to triage. I don't know if that actually gets to the heart of the question though.
Okay, Kimmy. So this is kind of goes off in a different direction a little bit, but somebody's put a question about housing, which connects to, the part of the conversation we are talking about balancing these different relationships with the land and uses of it. And they asked, there's much conversation in the Northeast of the United States today about a housing crisis, and there are many calls to rapidly build our way out of it. Did your observations of abandoned places give you insights into where and how we should build communities in the first place?
I suppose what I've been looking at is primarily the flip side of that, but mainly the communities where where there is most abandonment tend to be places that are urbanizing, and we have been generally seeing a sort of densification of communities over time, and to some extent, I sort of applaud that in as much as it can be a much more efficient way to live. That a lot of people want to live in urban environments, and that means that people become much more sort of packed together, and farmland and that agricultural communities tend to be decreasing, or I think the problems can lie in this more sort of like sprawling kind of development, maybe more suburban building where small numbers of people can take up a great deal of space. It's a bit of a mixed picture because say if you look at say in the UK, we have a big culture of gardening. And so if you look at the biodiversity of a square kilometre of London suburbs, actually the biodiversity is huge because there are incredible numbers of songbirds, plants, also garden plants, which are many of them are exotics. So it kind of shows up how difficult it is to value these things because biodiversity is a very sort of vague measure. I don't know if I'm getting at this properly, but I think that the building more densely helps in many ways. Some of them social and some of them environmental, and that more land may fall into abandonment naturally through these patterns that we're seeing unfolding really throughout the world.
It's an interesting segue, maybe to just if you have any reflections. I know you're here as a visiting writer scholar in the Northeast this year, and I'm just curious what your reflections have been being here in our home region, our service area, on the sort of attitudes that you encounter, the conversation that you're listening in on about environmental matters compared to what you might experience in the UK or Europe where you live.
Yeah, it's interesting, and some of them are kind of sort of subtle, different ways of looking at, and of course, I'm coming in as an outsider and only hearing small bits of the conversation, I'm sure. One thing I've noticed in the small town where I am is that the houses do tend to be sort of further apart, that there are fewer fences between gardens. That surprised me. And that there are sort of these areas of woodland within the town itself, which I found to be interesting. And so I have seen really quite a lot of wildlife inside the sort of suburban area where I've been living, put up by the university. But I've also seen like a lot more of an attitude towards, for example, clearing up leaves or this kind of tidiness in the landscape, which I think is much less visible in a small town of the same kind in the UK, which there's much more of an acceptance that trees drop branches and leaves and all of this kind of thing, that there are rabbits all around. I think that that is gardening culture in the UK used to be very sort of on top of tidiness, and that has changed a great deal in the last sort of 20 to 30 years. And I'm not sure that that is necessarily sort of come over here yet, but I might be misreading it. This is very much an outsider's perspective.
One of our guests wants to hear what you saw during the COVID pandemic, which, the COVID is now just kind of like the flu. It's still here. It's not considered a pandemic, I guess. But what, if anything, did you notice during the early days of the COVID pandemic in terms of nature disrupted? Has that affected the course of rewilding? Is that something you've thought about even, or?
I have thought about it. I thought, there was a lot of coverage of sort of the way that animals were retaking the streets, that sort of narrative that became very loud very early on. And to me, like I was just finished writing this book when this was unfolding, and so I had the sense and kind of the knowledge that it was too fast for that to be happening, that any kind of repopulation really takes a lot of time. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what it was revealing was how closely we are already living alongside a lot of different species in the landscape, even in places, you saw sort of like kangaroos in the central business district in Adelaide, all of this kind of thing, like they haven't come far actually. If they can do this in the matter of a few days, that means they're around. We're just not always seeing them. And so that was how I came to reflect on it, that regrowth and recovery doesn't happen so quickly. It takes a long time for proper the sort of rerouting of these assemblages to happen. But it shows that all these different species are constantly sending out scouts looking for places that they can take over. And I think that that's what we were seeing. And I find that to be reassuring in its own way. Yeah, I guess that's the way to put it.
They appreciated the opening and the landscape, a place they could scoot into. Um, I think a couple of people wanted to know what drew you to want to explore the kinds of landscapes that you explored, these abandoned places.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I always feel like I don't have a great answer to it apart from I find them fascinating and I find them frightening and intriguing. And I think I started doing it almost instinctively, that there was a sort of uncanniness in the landscapes that I was seeking out. And I quite often would go places thinking, oh, maybe I could write about this. And then when I would arrive, I would be like, no, it's not right. It's not right. It's not got the right combination of, and that helped me figure out what I was writing about. And it was to do with the length of time these places have been allowed to sort of run themselves. I ended up realizing that there was a sort of peak amount of time when you would enter this uncanny valley, that it was long enough that things were beginning to decay, that sort of control had been lost, but not so long that they had sort of lapsed into the ruin in which it just becomes landscape again. That there was this sort of point where sort of human control and other species were sort of interlinked in some way, and that those were the most unsettling places to be, and often the ones that were most interesting when you dug into it ecologically.
Thank you for that. So, somebody kind of wants to know about our responsibility cleaning up our messes. So, like, how do you square the mentality of leaving post-industrial landscapes alone to rewild with humans' ethical responsibility to clean up our messes? Could the rationale of embracing rare, feral, novel ecosystems be used to let ourselves, as a species, off the hook too easily in terms of environmental stewardship?
Yeah, I understand the question, and I think it's a pretty fraught one actually. First of all, the easiest thing to do is not to cause the masses to begin with. So that's the first and most important thing, which is, can we avoid contamination, especially long-lasting forms of contamination? Do we have to knock this down? Do we have to do this? You know, try to keep our impact as light as possible for as long as possible. In terms of past harms that already exist in the world, we then start coming into these ethical quandaries. So, for example, one of the places that I went to write about was Arthur Kill, just off the coast of water body off the coast of Staten Island, which is extremely contaminated with PCBs and other chemicals that will last forever, dating from a period in the 19th century where there were tanneries, where there were dye workshops, where they were producing Agent Orange for a time. And that these chemicals have sort of, in some places in the harbour, sort of settled into the silt. And so you have this sort of terrible Pandora's box situation, which is, do we go in, stir it all up, and remove it, which is ultimately actually what they're planning to do. It's a Superfund site of parts of the lower Passaic River. Or do you leave it and then sort of hope that it doesn't get stirred up by natural forces at some stage, or by unknowing people in a future date? So you've got this like terrible toxic secret at the bottom of the water. And I think it really is very difficult. It has to be done on a case by case basis. In that environment, you do actually have a number of fish species which have evolved to survive there. There is an ecosystem. Is it a healthy ecosystem? It's very hard to say. It's amazing that it exists at all. Well, no, it's not hard to say, sorry. Is it a healthy ecosystem? It's easy to say it's not a healthy ecosystem. But do you risk doing more harm by dragging it all up is the question. And I think that they've decided that it's so poisonous, it's so toxic, that's what they're going to do. That would be the most responsible thing. But it does mean that that whole environment is essentially going to start from a baseline of zero all over again. And so it does really extend that period of damage, and it is a new form of damage sometimes to go in and to repair. And so this idea of, you know, that will we make it better by repairing is, you know, this recovery of the landscape. It's very difficult to give a sort of pat answer to it, apart from, you know, what is the value of the feral ecosystem that's grown up. And as I say, there was that really interesting example with the Welsh site of special scientific interest, as they call it, where they feel that perhaps they have gone too far in reinvigorating the landscape. They brought in land from elsewhere, they got rid of heavy metals in the soil, and now they feel that they're left with a piece of land that is less interesting than what they had before, and certainly of less scientific note. These metallophyte plants are struggling and are much more rare than what is come to replace them. And I don't know, there's not really a right answer. It's a horrible situation to be in. I talk about how these places are, you know, call them forbidden experiments, which is that it's really immoral to allow them to exist, to have come into existence. Now that they're here, we can learn from them. But I'm not necessarily arguing that we should have more of them. Ideally, we would avoid them to begin with.
Yeah. And in our work with passive rewilding, we are generally trying to let nature direct the ebb and flow of life. However, we do subscribe to a concept called untrammeled, which is that when we, for example, are fortunate to create a new wilderness preserve, there may be things on the landscape, such as culverts, such as former dwellings, such as former sugar shack, maple sugaring operations with just miles of plastic tubing snaking all through the forest. And we do try to remove trammels. That is to say, things that are binding or restricting the ability of nature to take its course, but it has its limits. I don't know, Sophie, if you might want to comment on that. I believe there's a school bus somewhere on one of our lands that we don't think we're going to be able to, remove that trammel, but
Yeah,
we do our best.
some of them we can, without doing more damage. You know, at our Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve, I found right on the edge of the boundary, and I don't know if the people who sold the parcel to us knew this was there, had forgotten it was there, but left an real old logging truck. But it's it's not right next to a road at this point. The forest has grown up around it. It's been there a while. It's an old one. And, if we had to get it out of there, we'd probably have to cut a road, and do a lot of damage to a lot of trees that are growing there. And it's just, we take them one by one. Some are simple. If there's an old rusty culvert on the side of the road, we can take that out. Or if there's a building somewhere, we can go in and dismantle it. An old shack or hunting shed or something that's not being used, we can remove it. But we do try to remove a lot of those traces if they're not being inhabited. One time I was at a preserve in more southern Vermont, Bramhall, and I found a glass jar that somebody had dropped a very long time ago and didn't have a lid on it, and it wasn't broken, but it had filled with enough soil and it had been there long enough that there were all these really cool mosses growing inside of it. It looked like this little terrarium in the wilderness. I mean, it was just this amazing thing. And I was like, usually I take trash out, but I thought, it's just glass. It's not, I'm just going to leave this here. It wasn't something someone would step on, it's just in the middle of it. There's no trails or anything. But yeah, you see those things. The ones that are doing more harm, if it's a dam or a culvert or something, and you're, trying to get the watershed to not be moving in the crazy way that it does on these old roads, then those seem worth taking out. Otherwise, it's, hard to
I will say that I was very inspired by your chapter about the things in Scotland and the ecological succession that took place there. And we have a recently acquired preserve in Maine that has a very large gravel pit on it. And we have a commitment to try to do more to try to bear witness to the rewilding process on our lands. And we're looking and trying to sort of have a journaling system for our properties where we can make sure we're recording accurate observations of that process. And I'm particularly interested in that gravel pit to see what will unfold there as little bits of material and seeds start to come into that area.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
photograph of paraffin mines was just unbelievable. It didn't even look real the way they were. Yeah.
Yeah, when they produced them, they were producing them at such a rate that these things would they swallowed up a whole country house and estate. They were just throwing these superheated rock and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. You get this fan-shaped one called the Five Sisters, just outside of Edinburgh, which is this, I mean, it's really land art. To see it is on a monumental scale.
One of our shifting gears a little bit, but one of our participants is wondering if you're beginning to imagine policy or other recommendations for sites, such as the ones you've studied, for example, an abandoned asylum or abandoned manufacturing plants or other campuses. And they went on to say, I wonder if a lesson from your research might be a reduction in the management of nature reserves.
Yes, possibly. I guess I came across some really interesting models of management in different places, which has grown up, I guess, as case by case. There's an organization in the UK called Buglife, which owns a former, is it a gravel mine? Certainly it's a mine of some kind, which has become notable for a particular species of jumping spider. It's like the only place in the UK where you can find it. And Buglife have also taken on another post-industrial site called Canvey Wick. It's a former oil terminal, very much an open mosaic habitat, in as much as it has all these sort of concrete pads, old piers, and they actually allow the local community to go through. There's loads of teenagers kind of burning stuff all summer, but they actually find that to be not bad for invertebrate life, which is all they're interested in, bug life. And so they have this quite laissez-faire attitude towards it, as far as I can make out. And I think that's really interesting because it's those are their values and that's what worked for the species that they're interested in. And it seems like a very different way of approaching it. Again, they're looking at species that really respond well to disturbance. And so I suppose it depends on your priorities, what you are thinking about as organizations. Are you looking to have large areas of undisturbed land and the species that enjoy that? And I suppose also the aesthetic considerations that come with that, which might touch on what we were talking about, the kind of the trammeled aspects. Sometimes those are to do with the environment, but sometimes those are aesthetic as well. And I think that aesthetic values are values too. And so I think my main thing is to sort of wave my hand and say it depends, it always depends, and it really depends on the history of the land and also what the organization's priorities are. But yes, generally my role is to say, do you have to be in control of that?
How much can we not be in control of? Because we don't have a great track record all the time. Oh, I love this question. So when you were in Chernobyl, did you happen to see the black fungi, which has evolved to thrive on radioactivity?
My understanding, if it's the same kind of fungi that I'm thinking of, is that it's actually inside the sort of metal covering that is now on the reactor. And that's why it's so incredibly interesting, is that it's in really, really dangerous spot and it is thriving off like intense levels of radioactivity. If I'm thinking of a black fungi, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's the same one. So
So
no, I have
No,
not
you were
been
not
inside
able to see
the not been inside the reactor itself, no.
so it likes the environment of radioactivity, but it must be decomposing something. I wonder what it's eating.
It's eating.
Mm-mm.
So no.
I can't
How
remember
do
off the
they
top of
even
my
know
head,
it's there?
Well, I guess we have time for one final question here. So the abandoned and rewilding places you describe and show in photos sound and look amazing. It's wonderful to learn about their potential for recovery. I wonder about the future of these places, though. Typically, we think of wilderness as having permanent protection, ensuring a future dominated by natural processes. Will these abandoned sites see future disturbance from people again?
Probably. I think many of the abandoned sites that are most ecologically virile are to some extent ephemeral, that they have this changing cast of characters that are partly related to the sort of changes that are taking place on this site. So the human control of the site is maybe fading off, other species are coming in. Probably certain species will come to predominate at some stage. And then you have these like heady mixes of species that don't normally come into contact with each other, or that's one common story of these sites. So they're actually kind of difficult to save, and maybe trying to save the specific kind of landscape that I'm talking about in this project is a conceptual difficulty, that they are places in transition, that they are probably going to be different in another few decades, but not if we don't allow them to be themselves. I think that the question of protecting them is an interesting one, and actually in terms of things like abandoned farmland, we can see them as a great opportunity because often these sort of odd feral what would you call them, fallow areas, there's lots of them. They might be certainly in places in Europe that I'm thinking about, they might be purchased for very low amounts of money and they are not considered to be valuable at the moment, and they might become valuable, and certainly they have a certain amount of ecological value already, and that in terms of, for example, carbon sequestration naturally, they may become incredibly valuable for the future of the planet. And so that is a kind of opportunity to look at where abandonment is happening naturally, because it usually means that economically they're not incredibly sort of valuable sites. So that's one way to think about it. I don't know if that helps.
That's great. This has been such a rich conversation. We've been really fortunate to have you here with us. what did we miss? Anything you want to bring forward as we move towards the conclusion of our event?
I don't know if I'm going to bring anything up, but I think it is really interesting to sort of bring together, I guess, sort of conservation or protection at the. I guess I see you as working at the sharp end, right? You're thinking about policy, you're thinking about specific parts of land, you're thinking about what's the best thing to do, and often I come in a sort of conceptual level, and it's a really interesting question about how to have these different values link up. And I'm just really grateful to be here and to have a conversation about it. And I don't think I want to come in sort of banging a drum for a particular approach or policy, and that is not what I see my role as being. And so I really enjoyed this sort of back and forth conversation to hear what your thoughts are and what you're doing with your land.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think if I could recommend one to you of a book that is very core to Newt, it's Rewilding North America by Dave Foreman. And
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think maybe a difference from the nature of the Islands of Abandonment project, which was very much visiting discrete sites. One of the things that motivates us a lot is to think about a network of resilient and connected lands where wildlife can thrive and where we can think big, even at continental scale, as has been happening, for example, in South America, of really, really connecting up large cores of habitat with corridors and creating that sort of maybe arterial, sort of blood vessels where for our wild cousins, and that humans can then fit around all of that, but seed that space so that nature can thrive.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think those values are so important and really inspiring when we think about this on this sort of grand scale and what that means about us positioning ourselves as stewards or not of this world that we live in.
Terrific.
Well, in addition to the practical and the conceptual, also you bring in this third artistic element with the beautiful photographs and the beautiful writing, and it's really inspiring and a different way to think about these landscapes. So I appreciate it very much. It's time for us to wrap up. So I will just say on behalf of everybody who's been with us tonight, all the participants, thank you both, Cal, Nicie, for making time to be here tonight and for thoughtfully answering so many questions. To everybody who participated on Zoom, thank you for showing up. It's wonderful to have such a terrific turnout. The questions were really good. And it's just encouraging to know there's so many people with deep care and concern for wild places and for wild creatures. And it's great to spend an evening just learning together and thinking. So we will have a post-event email with information on the webinar recording that will come out. Also have some mention of other Northeast Wilderness Trust goings on. And if you're interested to learn more about becoming a sustaining Northeast Wilderness Trust Forever Wild Circle member that Nicie was talking about before with the bandanas, we've got a little link there up on the slide. And if you'd like to pre-order Cal's forthcoming book, The Savage Landscape, How We Made the Wilderness, there is a link here, and I'm sure you can also just pop that title into Google and Google will do its thing. Both of our organizations, Cal's website and Northeast Wilderness Trust, are listed on the bottom. So yeah, we hope to see you around in the future, and thanks for everything you do. Thanks again, Cal and Nicie. Really great conversation.
Happy solstice, everyone. Enjoy these the turning of the season.
Happy solstice. Thanks for having me.
Good night, everyone.
Nighty night.